Beni duyuyor musunuz? Evet, tamam. Bu sefer baştan başlıyorum. Merhabalar herkese. Bu duyuruyu kısacık Türkçe yapacağım. Ancak bu kısmın, yani bu oturumun dili İngilizce olacak. Türkçe halini dinlemek için YouTube'da kalmaya devam edebilirsiniz. Zoom'dan dinleyenler için Spanish kanalına geçmeniz gerekiyor Türkçe dinlemek için. Türkçe diye bir kanal yok maalesef, o yüzden Spanish'ten dinleyeceksiniz ama oradan çeviriyi dinleyebilirsiniz. Orijinal dili İngilizce olacak. Başlıyoruz. Evet, herkese iyi dinlemeler. Hi everyone, I'm Ceren Gamze Yaşar. I'm a member of the Executive Board of Chamber of City Planners in Turkey, and also I'm a PhD student in Middle East Technical University at Urban Policy Planning and Local Governments Department. And now we are going to begin our session. Before actually beginning the session, I want to remind you that all the audience already knows, but that we have experienced an earthquake in Izmir. So as a Chamber of City Planners, we are in solidarity with the people of Izmir who are facing kind of double disasters, while in the times of pandemic, they also have experienced an earthquake. So we are in solidarity with them. And today our guest speaker, our keynote speaker will be Keil, Professor Keil, as you can see on the other half of the screen. He is a professor at York University in Toronto, in Canada, and from the Faculty of Environmental Studies and the City Institute. His major field of research is Hey, again, sorry. Can you hear me, everyone? I guess you can now. Sorry, my connection is kind of strange today. His research interests are infectious diseases and cities, urban infrastructures, urban political ecology. You may know him from his prominent book, Suburban Planets, and also he is among the pioneer researchers and writers in the urban planning and urban policy field about COVID-19. So, and also there's a specific book which also includes Istanbul as well, Massive Urban Suburbanization, Rebuilding the Global Periphery. And he has written that book with scholars that we know are their names. There are some of them existent in the audience as well today. And sorry, I'm kind of lost after the connection lost. Actually, today we are here with the technology that we have started using more frequently after the pandemic. So we are kind of in strange times, living in a global pandemic era. And Professor Keil's presentation is also very relevant for our strange days. I'm now giving the floor to Professor Keil with his presentation named Beyond the Virus, Urban Research and Planning in Times of Risk and Uncertainty. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you, Ceren, for this really nice introduction. I'm sorry that you have these internet problems, but we all have them all the time. And you say, rightly, it's a new technology. And some of the topic of today is how we deal with crisis. And this is part of the problem, is the technology that we're using, and we're all affected by it. Thanks for the invitation. Hello to all my friends in Turkey that I haven't seen in a long time. And I'm glad there is so much interest in listening to. Based on a lot of collaboration with other people, over the last few months, but also years, as you will see, and I want to give credit to them. So I'll try to synthesize some of the work that we've been doing on the topic of cities and infectious disease, with a particular focus on what your conference, your meetings are about. I will share my screen if I. And here we go. I hope everybody can see this now. All right, so I'll talk to you about what we now need to begin to do, which is looking beyond the virus. But I'll keep it sort of in balance between urban research to learn more about the situation we're in, and to begin to think about planning differently in those times of risk and uncertainty. And like Ceren, these are the 5 points that I will try to get through in the half hour that I have. And we'll see how that goes. And like Ceren, who reminded us of the earthquake in Izmir last week, I also wanted to tip my hat and give a nod to Izmir, but also to Beirut, amongst other cities, which is close, of course, closer to you than to me in terms of the region where this is happening, as a reminder that when we talk about risk and uncertainty in our urban age during a pandemic, it is not just the pandemic that we have to deal with, but many people around the world have constant disasters, some as bad as the ones that are pictured here, others more daily disasters, things that normally don't work. And we'll talk a bit about that in a second. But it is important to remind ourselves and to feel, as Ceren said, solidarity with the people in Izmir and elsewhere that have double the load of risk and uncertainty at these very difficult days. So here we are already in the middle of the topic that I wanted to raise about how we have begun to think about this worldwide. And there are many voices, of course. Everybody has an opinion. Everybody seems to have become an expert on infectious disease. We all know much more than we ever wanted to know about infectious disease. So some people have been doing this, of course, professionally, talking about disaster planning and all that. And here's a Canadian journalist who is in the top left, who is speculating about why we're so bad at disaster planning, that the world is a multitude of looming disasters, and there is a chorus of endless chatter of experts that tell us that the world is going to hell. Then Teju Cole, a novelist, Nigerian-American novelist, wrote this book 10 years ago, Open City, and he says we're the first humans who are completely unprepared for disaster, and it is dangerous to live in a secure world. So we have lulled ourselves into this understanding that we live in a secure world. That is, of course, more a comment on the West and the North of the world, but it is nonetheless true. But other people who have looked at the world from the perspective of the global South, like Gautam Ban, Teresa Galdera, and Gillespie, and up to Malik Simon, who have recently written that we want to look at life worlds that cannot be so clearly divided into before and after the pandemic, and where crisis and the everyday are not so neatly separable. Right? So they are pointing out that in many parts of the world, the pandemic isn't the only one crisis that has now affected people, but we've been living in this kind of world, or they have been living in this kind of world, because I speak to you from Toronto. So there's a vocabulary that is part of planning, that is part of urbanism, but is often only used by specialists in disaster planning and emergency planning, but is about risk and hazards and emergency and crisis. And we need to understand this kind of language to some degree without becoming victim to this language, because it can take over. But one distinction is important generally, is that while hazards are natural, disasters are not. We are involved in making those disasters. A lot of people have pointed out that we have, at least since the beginning of the century, often identified with the attacks on 9/11, lived in a new normal. But for many people in the world, this new normal has been the always normal. This is always a world of uncertainty. And for many, many more, it is an intertwined relationship between some form of normal and some form of disaster all the time. What we do know now, that as we're in the 10th month of this, or 11th month of this pandemic, that as the Lancet, a leading medical journal, has recently written, it is time to forcefully impress on people that basic measures to limit the transmission of SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that leads to COVID-19, the disease, they are here to stay. This is the new normal. That, you know, maybe in January and February, we didn't understand that yet. We thought this is going to go away soon. But now we're beginning to understand that this is going to be with us for some time. So if we talk about the new normal, this is it. So I was talking about these specialist literatures that exist, people talking about emergency planning. And there is this term of systemic risk, which has begun to interest me to some degree, even though I'm not really a systems theory kind of thinker, but it is an interesting way to look at that because it gives us an understanding of those kinds of disasters like earthquakes or, you know, floods and climate change, but also infectious disease pandemics are not just natural occurrences, they're also social occurrences. So here is a list of things that people have been thinking about, the relationship of geophysical hazards or biological hazards to us, to how we are organized in society and cities and so on, which can contribute to the emergence, but also the spread of diseases, for example. Anthropogenic processes are central to our understanding of the systemic risk that we find ourselves in. And we immediately understand, and COVID has pointed that out to us very clearly, that unequal exposure to risk is central to any reality of systemic risk. To continue quickly, these systemic risks are characterized by high complexity. They are transboundary and global in nature. They have complex, and people say stochastic relationships between trigger and effect. We don't know quite what the relationships are. And there are tipping points, an important concept. And very, very importantly, if we look ourselves at planners and urbanists, you know, and active in this current pandemic as trying to be involved in moving our cities out of the pandemic situation, the lag in perception regulation in relation to the potential devastating impacts of systemic risk is really central to us as professionals and theorists to make that connection, because it takes a long time for us to understand what's going on. Meanwhile, there are entire industries busy with studying systemic risk. The insurance industry, as one example, is one of them, who are now dealing with this pandemic, but also with the Ebola pandemic that happened in West Africa 5 years ago, and now it's currently just being brought under control in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. That the insurance industry now insures the risk for pandemic disease, the way they can have earthquake insurance or flood insurance and those sort of things. And that is really something that you will see develop more over the next few years. And that's something we need to pay attention to, because it is, for us, again, as people who are interested in cities, it's an interesting thing, because cities will jump onto that bandwagon, particularly as this idea of smart cities will develop and more data is available. And so this is an industry that you will see growing, where we already see this idea of an insurance as important in this conversation about cities and risk, is in financialization of insurance risk. Zach Taylor, who studies real estate, particularly in Florida, has made that connection and talks about insurance-linked securitization, the marketization of insurance itself, where capital investors from the United States and Europe, institutional investors, invest into the financialization of insurance risk in areas that are flood prone because of climate change risk. Okay. All of that is also linked to those other bigger conversations that humanity has been having that have been toned down a little bit in the pandemic. Climate change is one of them in here. This is, for those of you who do a little bit of work on climate change, this is on climate denial also. This is something you're familiar with, the 5 stages of denial of climate change. Deny the problem, deny we're in that the cause of climate change, deny that it's a problem, and deny that we can solve it. And all of a sudden we're at the point where it's too late. And you can say that much of what we've been going through over the last 10 or 11 months has been following a similar kind of playbook. And there are connections here, sorry, to those other denials that we are familiar with, climate denial, environmental denial, health denial. So anti-vaxxers, people who don't believe in the in vaccination, climate change deniers, and anti-GMO activists all tick off the same boxes when you look at what they do and how they construct the world around them. So when we think about risk, disaster, hazards, these kinds of things, there's a lot of people who actually deny that those risks exist, or they deny the causality, how those risks actually affect us. And that is something that we need to overcome. Of course, the world hopes that in the next few days, one of the major voices in that denial will disappear from the political stage, but we will see about that. This is also an interesting picture that you may have seen recently, the Swiss cheese respiratory virus pandemic defense. It just shows that if you see on the left, the virus attacking the human body, then it has to go through various defenses. All of those defenses are like slices of Swiss cheese. None of them is perfect. And at the end, there is the vaccine, which now humanity hopes for. But it is a very complex set of nuanced defenses that we have to put up. And again, for us as urbanists, we need to see on the right side of this with shared responsibilities. That is really as planners, that's our area where we need to be active as social activists, as policymakers, as planners, and so on. But we also have, of course, a responsibility ourselves personally on the left side of this equation. All right, so let me get to the second part of my talk about urbanization and disease. Here it is important to understand what has changed, how the urban world has changed. So all of that goes back to this, the decade of the 1960s in a way, but in the 60s, we began to understand, and here is symbolically Henri Lefebvre's book, The Urban Revolution, we began to understand that we live in an urban society, that the majority of the world will eventually be urban by whatever classification that is. We can say that we're now living in an urban world, but at the same time, there was also this idea in modern societies that we conquered, we defeated infectious disease. So much so that some people believe that at the end of the 20th century, infectious disease would not be a problem anymore. We wouldn't have to deal with it. So these two processes are very much linked. And of course, we still live in an urban world, but we now have woken up to AIDS, HIV/AIDS. We have woken up to Ebola, to SARS in 2003, and now, of course, to COVID. So this idea that we are now in an infectious disease-free world clearly didn't hold, but that's the legacy. So we're coming out of this, and we're living in an urban world, and we need to understand better what that might entail. So our argument, the people that I've been working with here, in particular, Harris Ali and Creighton Connolly, our argument is that there is a shifting political pathology as we're entering a stage of extended urbanization. This can be, in some ways, be contrasted with what the work was that we did 15 years ago on severe acute respiratory syndrome, which attacked several global cities in the world, Singapore, Hong Kong, Toronto, and a few others in China, Hanoi, in Vietnam, other places like that, big global cities. And so SARS, in a way, exposed the exoskeleton of the global economy, through the global city systems. Wherever you found SARS, you would find a global city. That's as much as one can say. Now with SARS-CoV-2 that causes COVID, that is completely different, because now that virus exposed the flesh and bones of global capitalism, not the outer skeleton anymore. So here's this interesting quote by a writer, a Chinese writer, who says, Wuhan, the origin of, the geographic origin of the disease, Wuhan is one of the newly discovered inner lands of the global production chain as the Chinese coasts have become more expansive. So here we see now Wuhan is not an exotic production place outside somewhere, but it is now part of an inner land of something that is part of the global economy. And we understand it to be part of an economy that all of us are linked to. And the spread of the virus really showed that very quickly. And here are some images to show that. In the middle, the green map is the representation of the global city system. These are those big alpha, beta, gamma cities that have been written about for 40 years, 50 years now as global cities. But if you look at the left on the right, these maps are actual COVID infection maps from back in the summer, I think June or July. And you can see that when you look at the European map, you can find Istanbul and Ankara and so on there on this map, because it also includes the Middle East and North Africa. You can see that on this map now, the virus is everywhere. It's not anymore restricted to that exoskeleton of the global city. So this shift from the exoskeleton of the global city system to the inner worlds of urbanization, that determines how one constructs the narratives of the origin, transmission, outbreak, response, containment, and preparedness for the next pandemic, right? That's really important for us to understand, that we cannot look at it anymore as what we thought urbanization was like. Now urbanization is everywhere. And that relates to our general beliefs in how we live in this world and to understand who we are in this urban world. So the disease narrative that we construct about COVID or any future type of disease cannot be different from that narrative of global extended urbanization. All right, so cities and infectious disease is a symbiotic relationship. They always have coexisted. And there's a whole list of empirical questions that I don't want to go through, but you see how, you can study any aspect of that symbiotic relationship, and we must study every aspect of that symbiotic relationship historically, but also in the current world. One of the things that people have written a lot about is the question of density, and people have been on two sides or three sides, actually three camps, maybe four, that have said, some people have said, density is the problem. We are living in cities that are too dense, that creates overcrowding and that creates disease. Others said, no, it's good that we're urban because that gives us the means to actually fend off those kinds of threats. And other people like myself would say, density isn't really the problem. There are other things that need to be looked at. I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about density, but I'm saying it's not the problem. And here you see two maps of France from last week. One of them is the density map. The other one is the corona infection map. They look the same, but here we can't, as scholars and as practitioners, we can't really make the jump here to causation. This is a correlation of where people live and where they are sick. This has nothing to do with density causes disease, right? So we need to be careful as we do this. Again, this is a very important aspect of our work as planners and urbanists. So that gets me to my third part. Here you see a map of the Lombardy region around Milan, just also from 2 days ago, where there has been an upsurge of infections. And you see here that a lot of them are actually in the suburbs of Milan, in the northern suburbs. It used to be more around Bergamo. We are doing some work on Milan, and that you will see referenced in a bit. So the starting points for how COVID relates to urbanization is, as I already said, we live in an urban society. It is urban life's demands and needs that really have structured the trajectory of this disease. It is a disease that follows the urban and follows the extended urban to some degree. And it is important for us to realize that while this is an extended urban world, there are still bounded forms of territorial decision-making and governance. Our cities, our municipalities, our urban regions that we need to pay attention to. They're making the regulations about lockdowns and all those kinds of things. So we need to pay attention to what's going on here. And we also have realized that new types of social conflict and politics have arisen in this urban world, much around how we react to those measures that are put upon us by the state and others. So here, my colleagues that I work with on Milan and Toronto, we have put forward the idea that the disease, that COVID-19 is a disease of the social, spatial, and institutional periphery of that urban world. And here for the social periphery, just as an example, in the United States, in Canada, it is obvious that the majority of people, or let's put it this way, the higher rate of African Americans and people of color have been affected by, and indigenous people, by the virus than white people in North America. So that is part of the social periphery that is affected more. The spatial periphery also has been affected more than the center. Here is a map of Toronto, and you see the darker blue areas in the periphery of Toronto, where you find a lot of high-rise housing, like the one here on the picture, is affected. These neighborhoods have much, much higher rates of infection. That is because people live in these kinds of dense environments, but also because many people living in these neighborhoods work in low-level service jobs and have to be out there in the world. They cannot socially isolate. So this is where the spatial periphery meets the social periphery, of course. Then we have the institutional periphery, again, some numbers from Canada. We now have more than 10,000 deaths in Canada. And of those 10,000, more than 8,000 have died in long-term care homes, in old people homes. And that is a traumatic number, because it shows that the institutional periphery, the institution of long-term care and old age care, is not working. And that is attracting the virus in many ways. But also part of the institutional periphery is labor, working environments. And here is an example of many migrant workers in seasonal agricultural industries that of course now are shut down because of the winter. But those workers were particularly affected, and those industries were affected. So COVID looks for the periphery, it finds the periphery, and it wreaks havoc on the periphery. And I just want to put in a note here, don't take, when I use periphery, don't take that literally. It's a heuristic device. It's not an actual map. I'm not saying that all COVID cases are in the geographic periphery of our cities, but it is an attempt to think about COVID in a particular way. So that gets me to my fourth area, which is about pandemic urban governance. Here we'll be getting to this idea of what we can do after the pandemic. Here's a Toronto street, where the restaurants moved their tables out. That is now closed down because, again, of the winter. We are moving here we're moving into a world where, as we are globally planetary urbanized, we need to understand that the institutions to govern that world are still locked down in a nation state system. The WHO, the World Health Organization, is an organization of nation states. But there are now feeble attempts to bring cities into that conversation. And I don't want to dwell too much on that, but it is important that wherever you look, there's an example from Germany, an example from Canada, that the people who govern nations are now appealing to cities and making connections to cities. As I am speaking here, the mayors of the largest Canadian cities are having a webinar like this one on the relationship of large cities to each other and to the federal government in the pandemic. So this is an important topic everywhere, and it has led to all kinds of central and local conflicts. This is the mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, who last week angrily defied his government's, Boris Johnson government's policies that put a lot of restrictions on Manchester and didn't give them the funding to deal with the lockdown. So these are central local conflicts, and we have conflicts of extended urbanization. And I can't tell you the whole story now, so I just flip over that. My colleague Murat Uçoğlu, who is also listening in, is working on this case in particular. I wish I could tell you more about it. But then we have intra-city issues. Here, again, the northwest of Toronto, for example, where the neighborhoods that are poor even when there's no pandemic are now hit again, and there needs to be some form of policy that deals with these inequities in the city. But there are also community-based examples of fighting against pandemics. Here I'm just referencing some research that we're involved in West Africa. This is images from Dwarsak in Freetown in Sierra Leone, where 10,000 people died in West Africa in 2014-15 of Ebola. And we're trying to understand how communities, urban communities in those countries helped fight against that disease at the time and how they successfully did it. And we're trying to learn, and they did, how they learned from that for the current COVID outbreak, just as a point of reference. So there are divergent models everywhere. The cities that I'm studying, Milan, Toronto, Berlin, they're all different. They have different responses. And here you can ask yourself, of course, in the cities where you work, the cities where you live, what will be your model in a world of difference in reacting to this? Are there some best practices? Are there some fast policy mobilities where we learn from other cities? Are there things that we shouldn't do, perhaps? And that gets me to my last part, which is titled Beyond the Reveal. And you will understand in a minute why I called this Beyond the Reveal. I am using here an idea that is put forward by Richard Horton, the editor of that medical journal that I already mentioned, The Lancet, who has been talking about a syndemic approach, which puts together biological and social interactions of the disease. So for a medical journal of that stature to admit that a disease can have social origins, it's not just biology, is an important step for us to become active around that. So Richard Horton, talks about the vulnerability of older citizens, Black, Asian, minority, ethnic communities, and the key workers that are commonly poorly paid with fewer welfare protections, and immigrants. Those are the kinds of conversations we need to have and we need to be involved in. So syndemic urbanism is perhaps something that we might think will help us in that quest. So if there is something like syndemic planning and design, we all grapple with the literal and metaphorical blueprints of urbanism beyond the pandemic. We're all drawing up maps of what will the world be like. And that debate is wide open. Some people go back to categories of urbanism that they knew, but others are wildly speculating about the urban future. And we can see that still developing. Here are two voices that many of you will know. Richard Florida, Saskia Sassen, Florida, who lives in Toronto, has been a voice here, a very strong voice in the policy world. He recently made those comments about the creative class now moving perhaps back into these empty cities and youth coming back to the cities after the pandemic. I find that not so convincing for a variety of reasons that we can take up in the discussion perhaps. And Saskia Sassen, more careful, more thoughtful, and talks about the need to accept that this is a crisis moment. We can't just all move back and pretend that nothing has happened. And she says we need to protect ourselves, and whenever it is an option, we need to alert or help those who are at risk and do not know it. So here's more an awareness of the fact that this is a crisis and we have to move beyond that. And others here, there's three Toronto urbanists who wrote this manifesto in May called Canada's New Normal Begins in Our City. So there's a recognition of this moment by our colleagues and we need to think about how we're doing this. So when I said some people are moving forward very fast and want to move into a new urban world, here's one example that people are talking about: Zoom towns, places that are often in small towns that are close to recreational areas like ski hills or beaches, or some places like that where you can Zoom during the day or Zoom in the morning and do your office work, and then you go skiing in the afternoon. And there is obviously a huge exodus from some of the larger cities in the United States and Canada to these smaller places. That is an empirical fact. I don't know how sustainable it will be, but it's a privileged form of creating a new centrality, a new peripheral centrality, which we need to pay attention to. I'm not advocating for this, but I have to accept the fact that this is happening. And we need to think about that as planners. And we need to develop a perspective of seeing COVID through an urban lens, using the ideas of a Canadian political scientist by the name of Warren Magnuson. Here I wrote this short piece with a bunch of colleagues from around the world, where we made that argument to say we need to look at infectious disease from an urban point of view through an urban lens. That is going to be the basis. So because the body politic, which is now under attack, that is the city. So here's this idea about the beyond the reveal. You've all read this. I don't know what the Turkish word for the word reveal might be, but that kind of word exists probably in every language, is to disclose something. And a lot of people have said that the virus disclosed things. It held up a mirror to the city. This is true. It is true that the virus revealed many of the things that I actually mentioned in this talk, but the virus also hides things. The virus moves through the city and doesn't tell all the stories. It tells only a particular story. So we cannot afford, as planners and urbanists, to let the virus do the work of being political. We have to be political. We have to be the planners. We have to be the ones that make the decisions. Viruses don't plan cities. We plan the cities. We need to ask for the change we want, and we need to ask for the change that we need. So the syndemic nature, to come back to this idea of syndemic urbanism, of the crisis, won't allow us to forget that the spatial grammar of the pandemic is now also the spatial grammar of the city. That's the 2-meter rule. All those things have now become part of the understanding of how we organize our cities. But that's not the virus doing that. That's us doing it. And we need to understand it in that way. So there are different shades of adaptability, sustainability, resilience, resurgence. Clearly, I don't have the time to go into the different aspects of this, but you are working with these concepts too, many of you critically. So we need to think about how we can use that in a productive way. Will there be a normal to get back to? Should we get back to the normal that we knew? Is this health emergency just an emergency and we get back to something that we knew before? Or is there a longer term crisis like the long-term care that I mentioned that we need to fix? That is not just back to normal, is not the solution for that. And of course, there is a perpetuity of suffering for many people that were affected badly before the pandemic. It got worse during the pandemic. And to go back to some form of normal doesn't help these people at all. So finally, I want to go back to those authors that I mentioned before. And I say, for somebody who lives in Toronto, speaking to you in Turkey, we always need to learn from elsewhere. We need to acknowledge where we stand and where we are, but we also need to take in lessons from elsewhere. And here, these authors who are working on the cities of the global south have said, instead of the totalizing and singular narratives that the pandemic has produced, we are all in this together, for example, instead of that, we urge a focus on quotidian daily formations of collective life, a way of understanding the pandemic and the world that is attuned to southern urban processes and experiences. And I think that is really a good motto, a good philosophy to leave you with as we're beginning to do this work of moving beyond the pandemic. Thank you very much.
So, hi everyone, can you hear me? Thank you, Roger, Keil, for your presentation, and also thank you for saying that we are in this together. We're really in this all together, all around the globe, and we are facing really a massive kind of crisis. But as you said, it's like it's not a new thing actually. We are already deep into this crisis formation of world. So I don't know if people are hearing me or not, but I'm just speaking. Now my view is there. Yeah, so there are some questions. Do you prefer to hear all the questions at one time and then answer them, or do you want to go one by one?
I leave that up to you. You know, I don't know what.
Okay,
many
then
questions
I will
there are, but it's probably easier for you to bundle them a little bit. Yes. Yeah,
I'm going to bundle them a little bit. There are actually 5, 6 questions, but I'm going to summarize them into 4. To what extent, the first question is here, to what extent do you think bounded forms of urban governance at the time of a global pandemic can bring more authoritarian forms of local governance? The second one is, how do you think the central local conflict will shift the rescaling of the state? The third one will be large-scale metropolitan areas. Are they rising with this emergency response or not? The fourth one, how can we operationalize global urban governance? It's kind of a massive thing to do, but it's what is needed today, obviously. So how can we operationalize this global urban governance form of urban policy making? And maybe the last question might be this specific to Turkey, maybe. There are plenty of planners listening to you now, so they are working in the field directly. So I know that this is a huge question to ask, but I really want to kind of touch the praxis in Turkey. So do you have any suggestions for planners working in urban planning field to kind of cure the urban periphery? I mean, the urban sprawl is a massive problem in Turkey too. Nearly all of our metropolitan cities are widespread and they're really expanded to the geography. And we have plenty of problems. Some of them that you have already mentioned in your presentation, some of them are kind of specific to this country. And I really want to make the planners listening to you now kind of benefit from it really in solid ways. So I know that this is a huge question to ask, and I'm really sorry that I asked this, but I really want to ask this for all the planners listening to you. So these are the 5 questions that are asked throughout your session, and let's listen to you again.
Okay, so let me try to make some sense of it. These are very, very good questions. It sounds like a research program. So I'll try to be brief and to answer that as best as I can. Yes, very clear on the first question about the bounded territorial model of urban governance undeniably leads to new forms of authoritarian management. And I'll give you an example that the city of Toronto, where I live, has begun to deal with the homeless crisis in the city. We have a very severe winter here in Canada, And we're now beginning to see that more homeless people are on the street, and the city is now attempting in sort of this double action of putting the homeless out of the cold and putting them out of the reach of the pandemic, has created new spaces. And those spaces are dystopian spaces. They're plexiglass cages. So, you know, I would call that an authoritarian measure, and it's been criticized on social media and in the care community here in Toronto. It's a global scandal. A friend from Germany actually was the first to send me a picture of those plastic plexiglass cages for our homeless people. So as cities are reacting to these crises, they are tempted to do that often, depending on, of course, their political agendas, but they're tempted to do other things that have nothing to do with the crisis. So as they're trying to manage the homeless, they're also trying to manage homelessness as a problem in a very authoritarian way. And that is typical for many urban governments. One has to say, though, and you, I know, have that exact case in Istanbul, as far as I know, and I want to speak about Turkey that I know little about, but we know that places like Barcelona and Madrid and Berlin and Vienna and many places around the world where you have territorial government in progressive hands. I used Manchester as an example earlier, that those territorial governments have actually been more progressive across the board than many of the national governments where those cities are. So I think it can go both ways. These cities the territorial governments of cities can be laboratories of democracy, or they can also be small authoritarian dictatorships. We certainly had that in Toronto about 10 years ago under a mayor called Rob Ford that many of you probably have heard about. The rescaling of the state, that's another interesting question. Yes, you can see that some people have said, they use that example because I already mentioned it, that conflict between Manchester and London, or Manchester and the central government in the UK, is expressive, of course, of historical inequalities between the north and the south, and with the center and the cities, between the Tory government and the Labour cities. All of that is history, but it also leads to the assumption that many people have made that the UK as a government, the UK as a nation state is falling apart. It's like that Swiss cheese model to some degree. We have separatists in Scotland. We have the Irish question. We have the north of England. We have Wales, and all of a sudden now you also have the cities back in the picture as players in a rescaling of what government in a nation even means, that has just separated itself as a nation from Europe, has descaled itself from Europe. So this is a very interesting moment for those kinds of relationships. I'm glad you asked that question. I've made notes that I can't read about the question of the large scale rising or not. Maybe you can repeat that in a minute.
It's large-scale metropolitan areas. Are they in rise, or are they kind of declining within the pandemic, within the process of pandemic? And also, may I add one more question? There's one more question from Zoom chat, I guess. One of my colleagues asked that people are now working from home because of the pandemic. So is there a way to go back to rural settlements or small-scale settlements in general? So do you expect any kind of a new wave of maybe back migration from urban to rural, maybe? So there's one additional question. And the other question is large-scale metropolitan areas, are they rising or not? So I'm just...
Yes, thank you. So yeah, I had written that down the wrong way. So the large-scale areas have been very much affected. You saw these maps that I showed of Milan. I could show you similar maps of Toronto. And the large areas in North America, large urban areas, were the first ones to be affected by the pandemic, but it was the peripheral areas, as I said, in those large-scale areas. Wuhan, as a major global city, was affected first, and then it went to those places which had trade or touristic relationships with Wuhan and with other places. Even though the basically airlines pretty much stopped flying to Wuhan, that was one place of origin. So another one was the ski areas, of course, and people who were on ski vacations in the center of Europe went back to those large urban areas where they lived. So some of those places became epicenters, became hotspots. Now, a lot of people have said that over the last little while, as the virus protruded into other parts of countries, that it moved away from those large urban centers, and those large urban centers were less affected by the pandemic itself. I don't think this will be a major break in large-scale metropolitan or post-metropolitan urbanization. I think most places like the Ankara region or the Istanbul region, the Toronto region, those places will just keep on growing for reasons that have nothing to do with the pandemic. But I'll get back to that when I answer that last question in a minute. How can we talk about global urban governance? Yeah, that's an interesting question. The WHO initiated about 11 or 12 years ago a process by which they wanted to bring cities into the conversation, because the WHO, because it's a United Nations style organization, they can't talk directly to Istanbul or to Shanghai or to Toronto. They can't, for diplomatic reasons, they have to go to Ankara, to the national government. They have to go to Beijing, to the national government, and they have to go to our national government in Ottawa if they want to talk to Toronto, right? So there is no direct relationship between the World Health Organization and the cities, and there is no direct relationship really amongst those cities. But that has changed a little bit in the last 10 years for reasons, again, that have nothing to do with the pandemic per se, but it had to do with climate change. So there are organizations like the C40 organization of mayors. These are some of the largest cities in the world. And they have started to organize themselves. And it's on the back of those kinds of new networks that have been created in a climate change affected world that we now see some action that show that cities themselves begin to play an active role in global pandemic governance. I've just arranged yesterday to do a similar webinar as this one, where I'll be the moderator. Like Ceren is right now, I will be her in 4 weeks, and I will do a panel like this on where we hope to compare and connect the experiences from Wuhan, Johannesburg, New York, and Paris, exactly because we're interested in the role that metropolitan regions can play in that area of global governance. So that is really important. There's another aspect to this, which is diaspora communities everywhere also are connected in a world of social media. Of course, immigrant families around the world who live in these large centers talk to each other. And so there is information spread going on, which leads to different forms of politics around the pandemic that didn't exist 20 years ago, when it cost you, €5 a minute to make a phone call. And now, of course, you can be there on Zoom and Skype and on FaceTime, and you can make those connections. And so urban governance as citizen-driven, bottom-up understanding of information flow, contact tracing, those kinds of things are now in the hand of local communities, and they can be connected around the world. Planners, what can we do in the Turkish urban periphery? I'll be very careful not to say the wrong things here, because I know there are 100 people on this call who know much more about this than I do. But I want to say that, of course, from my point of view, having been in Istanbul only, in the Istanbul region, it's the only part of Turkey that I've seen in 3 visits that I've had. I have to say that, of course, what I can see is that Istanbul is in a way, and Ankara probably too, in the bigger cities, the other big cities also, are a bit like what Edward Soja, the famous geographer from Los Angeles, said about Los Angeles 40 years ago, which is Istanbul or the Turkish cities themselves have a bit of everything. They have a bit of an old medieval style or ancient city around which there is postmodern geography. They have, Istanbul now has the largest airport in the world. You have an auto industry with huge highways that are clogged up. You have, but also a rapid bus systems. Those are all things that happen at the same time. And that's the product of a developmental state that has developed Turkey as a nation, and it developed an urban concept around the way you built residential housing, the TOKI, and the housing, the commercial centers and mosques and everything around those new housing areas. All of that explosively entered a history which is thousands and thousands of years old. You have some of the oldest cities in the world, and you have some of the newest cities in the world. So the peripheries needs to grow into that historical geography, which is really, really difficult to do. And there will be a lot more growing pains in the future. I think eventually the movement of, people will stop from the countryside, which of course has led to much of the growth of your large cities, has populated those peripheries. So that will stop at some point, and then you will have to deal with a post-suburban environment in which you will have to deal with what is there, and you have to see this get old. I don't know how all these new, shiny new high-rise settlements at the periphery of your cities, how they will age. We don't know. We don't know that about China. We don't know it about Singapore. We have a bit of an idea of what happened in places like Paris or Toronto, which did this 50 years ago, right? We know the banlieue of Paris and the problems around the banlieue of Paris. We also don't know whether Turkey will have more geopolitical instabilities. The Syrian war now seems to have ended, but you have become the home of 2.5 million Syrians, as far as I know. So these kinds of things have something to do with what the potential of those peripheries will be. And of course, as a European nation at the cusp of Asian urban traditions, you have to also reconcile that. You have places like Beyoğlu on the one hand, and you have very, very different types of urban settlements in other parts of the country. So how will peripheries relate to that is a big question. All of those questions Edward Soja didn't need to ask for Los Angeles, because Los Angeles is not as old as your city. So Los Angeles can say, if we use that as a model, is an impromptu city that happened at once. Lastly, the question of the countryside. Yeah, this is interesting. And that's why I brought in this idea of those Zoom cities. That's a fact. It's a fact that a lot of people are, often privileged people, are looking to live outside cities at least some of the year. That has been you could observe that all the holiday rentals in north of Toronto on beautiful lakes have been rented. Cottages, they have been selling like hotcakes. That is a fact. But I think this question, which has been asked of me of a couple of journalists recently, and I tell you what I told them, this question is actually misleading in many ways. Because if you really want to deal with the pandemic and the fallout of a pandemic, moving to the countryside is not going to save you, because the hospitals are in the city, the healthcare is in the city, the social structures are in the city, the research on those diseases are done in the cities. So you can't save yourself. If you can fly in and out by helicopter, that's fine. Then you can sit in your loneliness in the countryside, and that's possible. But you can't live like that forever. So that's one thing. The second reason why that is a distraction is that the majority of people who currently live in cities don't have a choice. they can't just pack up and move to the countryside. What will they do in the countryside? They have jobs in the city. Their children are in school in the city. They have parents to take care of in the city. Why would they pack up and move to the countryside? So while it is a temporary and clearly a phenomenon that we have seen around at least North America, also partly in Europe, it's not going to be a sustained massive leaving of the city that is going to happen here. It's economically impossible, socially impossible, culturally impossible. All of those things are just fantasies, and they will not take place. But people will look at different ways of looking at the relationship of cities and the hinterland. I heard an interesting paper by a Russian colleague just last week who said that I think 2 million people or something moved out of Moscow in the summer to their dachas, to their country houses, but only 1 million people came back to Moscow. So that is an interesting phenomenon. And so I'm not saying it's entirely impossible that this happens, but it is not going to be the end of the cities. The countryside will not replace cities, but it gives us the opportunity to think differently about how we live in cities, whether there's something that we built in cities which doesn't work when there is an emergency and a pandemic and any other. That's the same questions we're asking about climate change adaptation, right? So we say we are building cities that are full of concrete and tar and streets that don't absorb any water. Now we have floods all the time, right? So we should be building different cities. That is the kind of question that comes out of that. Maybe the city needs to be more country, and maybe the country needs to be more city.
It was really a nice ending. Thank you for all the answers. It was kind of full of ideas, and it was really, I don't know, maybe inspiration is not that good word, but I think it kind of leads to different ends if people will follow the words that you have used, especially in the answers part. So really, thank you, Roger. Actually, there are plenty of other questions that people are asking, but I guess our translator is really kind of tired, and also we are kind of in the limits of our speech session. So we are sorry that we cannot be able to cover all the questions that you have asked to Professor Roger Keil. And I really want to thank you, Roger, and also our translator and Chamber of City Planners for organizing these sessions and this colloquium 100% online due to pandemics, which is kind of the advantage of the pandemic, I might say. So really, I really want to thank you, the audience as well. So yeah, that's all. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.
And
thank you very much, Ceren, and thank you to the interpreter, to the translator. Thank you very much. I know how hard it is to do this, and I talked very fast. And thank you for everybody who came. I hope to be able to come and visit Turkey in the near future whenever this is over. And until then, I wish you all the best for the rest of your conference. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you.